So I ended up getting interested in science back when I was in middle school. I ended up doing a research project on solar cookers, and I started to realize the impact that science and engineering and design could have on developing countries and improving the planet. Continued to get interested in this when I started to realize throughout high school and in my early college years just the impact that I personally have had on the planet, and I wanted to make a difference with that and study the planet and see what we can actually do to make it a little bit more sustainable for all of us in the long run. So currently I study harmful algal blooms up in Northwest Ohio and some in Central Ohio, and I study the toxicity of harmful algal blooms specifically. So this is something that's not been assessed throughout the state of Ohio at this point in time. We've kind of assumed that harmful algal blooms are all created equal, and they are certainly not. So some of them are very toxic and some of them can look pretty terrible and be just fine. So I've been collecting phytoplankton samples, which is just the concentrated green stuff that you'll see in the water, and doing toxicity experiments on them to actually evaluate where, what time of the season is the worst in terms of the harmful algal bloom development, and in what types of blooms and in what parts of the state. That's what I've been doing for the last year. The appearance of blooms definitely does not always relate to how toxic it is. I've seen water that looks completely fine and has very high toxin levels in it, and I've seen water that looks horrific and that nobody would go in, and that it has no detectable toxins in it at all. And so the problem with this is when people see a bloom, they are automatically assuming that it's not safe to go into the water, and then when they don't see a bloom, they assume that it's fine, and that's not actually true. So that's where my research really starts to look into why is this happening, why sometimes are the blooms more toxic, and what we're finding is depending on the type of bloom, the type of organism that's producing it, we'll get more toxicity at different parts of the season, is what the research has been showing. Well, last year was my big sampling year for my PhD. So what I did was I had 5 sites for Phytoplankton Collection around the state. And so I went out to each of these sites once a month for 6 months, and I collected a phytoplankton sample, which is just taking this big net and concentrating down the phytoplankton. And so you just take the net, and it's just a way of concentrating all of the green stuff you're seeing in the water, essentially. And I take those samples and end up using them on little small organisms that look they're smaller than gnats. And we expose them to the toxins, to the phytoplankton with the toxins in it, and see basically how many of them die and at what concentration. So this can give us some idea about how toxic the blooms actually are, without scaling it up to something like a mouse study or whatnot. It's a very small organism that we're using. So that's what I've been doing for the last year, to get a baseline assessment of where we are in the state with toxicity in these blooms, because it just has not been done. I think that they should know what causes harmful algal blooms. I get that question a lot from people who are really distressed by seeing what's happened to their local lakes and don't understand what's caused it. And so the thing I always like to tell people when I'm out at docks and sampling is that this is an issue that we do have a lot of control over. It is primarily an agricultural runoff issue, and so what happens is fertilizer goes onto those fields, and if it's not applied, if it's applied right before a storm, or even just if it's applied under the best of circumstances, at least a little bit of it is going to run off. And the fertilizer, which is food for plants, happens to also be food for algae. So it eventually washes off, it doesn't disappear, it goes into our waterways. We get all this food, and then we've now fed them really well, so they're going to bloom, they have really large blooms because of that. And then with also rising temperatures with climate change, we've also really made a nice incubator for a lot of harmful algal blooms with warmer water temperatures too. So I want people to know that fertilizer use is the primary cause of it, primarily from agriculture, but it is actually something that you and I can, everyone has a part in. Every time we put on fertilizer into our yards, think about when you're putting it on. How much do you really need to put on and the timing of it? Don't put it on right before a rain event. Realize that all of us are part of this issue and that all of us can be part of the solution of the issue as well. The two major impacts that have really occurred because of this harmful algal bloom issue has been for drinking water contamination and recreational problems as well, impacts from it. So the drinking water aspect has been in large part, in most places, resolved with really advanced, expensive treatment. So that's an expense to society that we're now paying because we're having to go above and beyond with our engineering with these water treatment plants. In the recreational aspect of it, that has largely not been solved. Places like Grand Lake St. Mary's that I've gone to, it's a really sad sight to see because, I go there and there used to be dozens of boat docks that just were filled with boats and there's no one there. All the hotels have closed, cottages have gone out of business. I mean, it's pretty decimating, or it's pretty detrimental to these local communities when they have a long, sustained harmful algal bloom, as we've seen with Grand Lake St. Mary's or Buckeye Lake.